Imagine a world where the economy can collapse not because of some natural disaster or war, but because of a sudden shift in human psychology. A world where millions of workers are willing to labor, where factories sit idle, where resources lie unused, and where the only thing standing between prosperity and devastation is a collective loss of confidence. This is the world that John Maynard Keynes stepped into when he published his most famous work in 1936, The General Theory of Employment. Interest and Money was not merely another economics textbook, it was a detonation beneath the foundations of classical economic thought, a book that would reshape governments, redefine the role of the state, and alter the trajectory of the entire 20th century. To understand this book is to understand the intellectual earthquake that followed the Great Depression, and to grasp why the way we think about money, work, and government intervention has never been the same since. To appreciate the magnitude of what Keynes accomplished, we must first understand the intellectual landscape he inherited. The year was 1936, and the world was still reeling from the catastrophic collapse that began in 1929. Stock markets had vaporized trillions of dollars of wealth, banks were failing by the thousands. Unemployment in the United States had climbed to nearly 25%, in Britain, it had reached a staggering 22%. Entire communities had been reduced to breadlines and Hoovervilles, and yet, the dominant economic wisdom of the age insisted that the economy would eventually correct itself. The classical economists, heirs to Adam Smith and David Ricardo, believed in what they called Say's law, the idea that supply creates its own demand. In their view, if people produced goods and services, someone would eventually buy them. Markets, left to their own devices, would naturally settle at full employment. Any unemployment that persisted was merely a temporary friction, a mismatch of skills or geography that would resolve itself with time. But the Depression did not resolve itself. Years turned into nearly a decade, and the classical predictions proved spectacularly wrong. This was the crisis of confidence that Keynes sought to address. He was not a man who had retreated to an ivory tower to develop abstract theories, he was a man who had been at the heart of global financial and political affairs. Born in Cambridge in 1883, Keynes had a mind that seemed almost preternaturally sharp. He excelled at mathematics and classics at Eton. Before moving to Cambridge University, where he studied under the great economists of his day, he was a member of the famous Bloomsbury Group, surrounded by artists, writers, and thinkers who challenged conventional wisdom in every domain. But economics was his true passion, and by the time he wrote The General Theory, he had already served as an economic advisor to the British Treasury during the First World War, had witnessed firsthand the catastrophic terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and had published his own tract on monetary reform in 1923, which had already marked him as a divergent voice in economic thought. The general theory emerged from a mind that had spent 2 decades wrestling with the fundamental question of why economies oscillate between boom and bust. Keynes was haunted by the paradox that the very mechanisms classical economists celebrated as the engine of prosperity could, under certain conditions, become the source of catastrophic failure. He wanted to understand not just how economies work in equilibrium, but how they behave when they are not in equilibrium. This was a radical shift in perspective. Classical economics had spent centuries building elegant models of how markets coordinate the decisions of millions of individuals, but Keynes asked a more urgent question. What happens when that coordination breaks down? What happens when the price system, that great invisible hand, simply fails to clear the market for labor? The book itself is structured around a series of interconnected arguments that build upon each other like the floors of a great building. At its foundation lies the concept of effective demand. This is the idea that the level of employment in an economy is determined not by supply, as classical economists believed, but by demand. Specifically, it is aggregate demand, the total spending in the economy, that determines how many people are employed and how much output is produced. If aggregate demand is insufficient, the economy will settle at an equilibrium with substantial unemployment, and there is no automatic mechanism that will push it back to full employment. This was a devastating critique of the classical view, and it changed everything. Keynes broke down aggregate demand into its components: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. He then proceeded to analyze each of these components with a psychological depth that was unprecedented in economics. Take consumption, for example. Classical economists had assumed that people save out of their income and that savings are automatically channeled into investment. But Keynes introduced the revolutionary idea of the marginal propensity to consume. He argued that as income rises, people do not increase their consumption by the same amount, they save a portion of any additional income. This means that consumption does not rise one for one with income, and there is a gap between what is produced and what is consumed. This gap, this leak in the spending stream, is what creates the possibility of insufficient aggregate demand. The concept of the marginal propensity to consume led Keynes to one of his most powerful insights: the multiplier effect. When someone spends $1, that dollar becomes someone else's income. That person then spends a portion of it, which becomes yet another person's income, and so on. The initial spending ripples through the economy, generating a total increase in income that is a multiple of the original amount. The multiplier is calculated as 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save. If people save 10% of any additional income, the multiplier is 10. This means that a $1 billion increase in government spending could theoretically increase total income by $10 billion. The multiplier effect became the intellectual weapon that justified government intervention in the economy. If private demand is insufficient, government spending can fill the gap and set in motion a chain reaction of income and employment growth. But if consumption is the steady, predictable component of demand, investment is the wild card. Keynes devoted enormous attention to the nature of investment and the forces that drive it. He argued that investment is highly volatile, driven not by cold calculation but by what he called animal spirits. Business investors act on a spontaneous urge to action rather than sitting in weighted averages of conflicting advantages. This psychological dimension of investment was a radical departure from the rational actor models of classical economics. Keynes understood that business confidence can shift suddenly and dramatically, that investors can become suddenly pessimistic about the future profitability of their enterprises, and that when they do, investment collapses, dragging the entire economy down with it. The volatility of investment is compounded by another of Keynes' key concepts, the marginal efficiency of capital. This is essentially the expected rate of return on an investment project. Keynes argued that the marginal efficiency of capital is highly unstable because it depends on expectations about the future, and expectations are inherently uncertain. Investors are not calculating machines that can compute the present value of all future cash flows with precision. They are human beings making decisions in a fundamentally uncertain world. When confidence wavers, the marginal efficiency of capital can plummet, and investment can dry up almost overnight. This was precisely what happened during the Great Depression. Businesses that had been eagerly expanding during the boom suddenly saw their expected returns collapse, and the investment that had been sustaining demand evaporated. Now we come to one of the most important chapters in the general theory, the chapter on the propensity to save and the propensity to invest. Here Keynes addresses the classical claim that savings are automatically invested. Classical economists believed that the interest rate serves as the balancing mechanism that ensures all savings are channeled into investment. If people save more, the interest rate falls, making borrowing cheaper and encouraging investment. If people save less, the interest rate rises, discouraging investment and encouraging saving. It was a beautiful and elegant mechanism, but Keynes argued that it simply does not work in the way classical economists claimed. The reason is that savings and investment are determined by different factors. Savings are primarily a function of income, while investment is primarily a function of the marginal efficiency of capital and the interest rate. Changes in income adjust savings to match investment, not changes in the interest rate. This insight has profound implications. It means that the economy can settle at an equilibrium where savings equal investment, but where that equilibrium involves massive unemployment. In the classical view, savings and investment are balanced through the interest rate, and this balance always occurs at full employment. In Keynes' view, savings and investment are balanced through changes in income, and this balance can occur at any level of employment, including levels far below full employment. The economy can be in equilibrium with 3 million unemployed people, and there is no automatic mechanism that will push it toward full employment. This was perhaps the single most important theoretical breakthrough of the general theory. Another crucial chapter deals with the theory of interest. Classical economists had viewed interest as a reward for saving, a compensation for postponing consumption, but Keynes offered a completely different explanation. He argued that interest is not determined by the real factors of saving and investment, but by monetary factors. Specifically, interest is the reward for parting with liquidity. People hold money for three motives: the transactions motive, the precautionary motive, and the speculative motive. The transactions motive is the need for money to carry out everyday purchases. The precautionary motive is the desire to hold money as a buffer against unexpected expenses. The speculative motive is the desire to hold money in order to take advantage of future changes in the price of bonds. The speculative motive is where things get interesting. Keynes argued that people hold money speculatively because they are uncertain about future interest rates. If people expect interest rates to rise, they will hold money rather than bonds, because rising interest rates cause bond prices to fall. If people expect interest rates to fall, they will buy bonds, because falling interest rates cause bond prices to rise. This means that the demand for money is not fixed, but depends on people's expectations about the future, and because these expectations can shift suddenly and dramatically, the demand for money can become highly volatile. When people become uncertain about the future, they may decide to hold more money rather than invest it, and this increase in the demand for money pushes up the interest rate, which in turn depresses investment and output. This leads us to one of Keynes' most controversial and revolutionary ideas, the possibility of a liquidity trap. A liquidity trap occurs when interest rates have fallen to such a low level that people are willing to hold any amount of money at that rate. In this situation, monetary policy becomes ineffective. No matter how much the central bank tries to increase the money supply, people will simply hold the extra money rather than spend or invest it. The economy can become stuck in a depression with interest rates near zero, and there is no monetary remedy. This insight proved remarkably prescient, anticipating the policy dilemmas that central banks would face during the financial crisis of 2008 and the pandemic recession of 2020. Keynes also devoted significant attention to the distinction between short-run and long-run analysis. His famous quip, often paraphrased as "in the long run we are all dead," was directed at economists who comforted themselves with the belief that markets would eventually correct themselves. Keynes was saying that waiting for the long run to arrive is a recipe for accepting unnecessary suffering. The economy can remain stuck in a depression for years, and people are suffering in the meantime. Economic policy cannot afford to be indifferent to the short run. This was a deeply moral argument, rooted in Keynes' conviction that economics must serve human beings, not the other way around. The general theory also contains a sophisticated theory of employment that challenges the classical view of wages and prices. Classical economists believed that unemployment was caused by wages being too high. If workers were willing to accept lower wages, employers would hire more of them, and unemployment would disappear. But Keynes argued that this reasoning is fundamentally flawed. Lower wages do not necessarily lead to more employment because lower wages also mean lower incomes, which means lower demand for products, which means less production and fewer jobs. This is what economists now call the paradox of thrift, though Keynes articulated it in a more nuanced way. When everyone tries to save more by spending less, the result is not more saving but less income and less saving overall. The economy can get trapped in a vicious circle of falling demand, falling incomes, and falling employment. One of the most important chapters in the book is the one on the multiplier, where Keynes elaborates on the mechanism by which an initial change in spending leads to a larger change in national income. He illustrates this with a simple but powerful example. Suppose the government decides to build a bridge. IT hires workers and pays them wages. These workers then spend their wages on food, clothing, and other goods. The people who sell these goods now have more income, and they spend a portion of it. This process continues, with each round of spending generating less and less additional income, but adding up to a total increase in income that is a multiple of the original government expenditure. The multiplier effect is not just a theoretical curiosity. IT is the intellectual foundation for fiscal policy, the idea that governments can stimulate the economy by increasing their spending or cutting taxes. Keynes also devoted considerable attention to the role of expectations in economic decision-making. He recognized that the future is fundamentally uncertain. Not just risk can be quantified and insured against, but uncertainty cannot. When investors make decisions about capital projects, they are trying to predict events that may never happen before. They are guessing at consumer preferences, technological innovations, political developments, and competitor behavior, none of which can be known with any certainty. This inherent uncertainty means that investment is always vulnerable to sudden shifts in confidence. The business that seemed profitable yesterday can look hopelessly unprofitable today if a piece of news changes the outlook. This is why investment is the most volatile component of aggregate demand and why economies are prone to booms and busts. The book also contains a rich discussion of the distinction between voluntary and involuntary unemployment. Classical economists had assumed that unemployment was voluntary, that people who are unemployed choose not to work at the prevailing wage. But Keynes argued that involuntary unemployment is a real and persistent phenomenon. It occurs when workers are willing to work at the current wage but cannot find employment because aggregate demand is insufficient. This is not a temporary mismatch or a friction in the labor market. It is a systemic failure of the economy to generate enough demand to employ all who are willing to work. Recognizing the reality of involuntary unemployment was a crucial step in justifying government intervention. If unemployment is voluntary, then government action is unnecessary. If it is involuntary, then government has a moral obligation to act. Another fascinating chapter deals with the concept of full employment. Keynes did not define full employment as zero unemployment. He recognized that there would always be some frictional unemployment, people moving between jobs, and some structural unemployment, mismatches between skills and jobs. Full employment, in Keynes' view, meant the level of employment at which there is no involuntary unemployment. It was the point at which everyone who wants to work at the current wage can find a job, but this full employment equilibrium could be at a level far below what the economy is capable of producing. The classical assumption that full employment is the natural state of the economy was, in Keynes' view, a dangerous illusion. The general theory also contains an important discussion of the distribution of income and its relationship to aggregate demand. Keynes argued that the way income is distributed across society affects the level of consumption and therefore the level of aggregate demand. Since poorer people tend to consume a larger fraction of their income than richer people, a more equal distribution of income tends to support higher aggregate demand. This was a subtle but important point that challenged the classical focus on production and efficiency. For Keynes, the question was not just how to produce efficiently, but how to ensure that there is enough demand to absorb what is produced. One of the most striking aspects of the general theory is the way it bridges the gap between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Before Keynes, economics was predominantly microeconomic, concerned with the behavior of individual consumers and firms and the functioning of individual markets. Keynes shifted the focus to the economy as a whole. He asked questions about aggregate variables, total output, total employment, total consumption, total investment. This was a revolutionary shift that gave birth to modern macroeconomics. The tools and concepts that Keynes introduced in the general theory, such as the multiplier, the marginal propensity to consume, and the liquidity preference theory of interest, became the foundation of the entire field of macroeconomics. The book also contains a sophisticated analysis of the role of money in the economy. Classical economists had treated money as a neutral veil, a medium of exchange that facilitates trade but has no real effects on the economy. This was the doctrine of monetary neutrality, which held that changes in the money supply affect only nominal variables like prices and wages, not real variables like output and employment. Keynes challenged this view by arguing that money is not neutral. The amount of money in the economy affects the interest rate, which in turn affects investment and output. Money matters. It is not just a veil. This was a profound insight that had important implications for monetary policy. If money is not neutral, then the central bank can influence the real economy by managing the money supply and interest rates. Keynes also devoted considerable attention to the international dimensions of his theory. He discussed the role of exchange rates, international trade, and capital flows in determining aggregate demand and employment. He argued that in an open economy, the balance of payments plays a crucial role in determining the level of output and employment. The trade deficit, for example, represents a leakage from the domestic spending stream that reduces aggregate demand and output. This was an important extension of his theory that anticipated many of the debates about globalization and trade imbalances that would dominate economics in the decades to come. The reception of the general theory was anything but uniform. When it was first published, it provoked fierce debate and intense criticism. Many economists were horrified by what they saw as a radical departure from established doctrine. The classical economists, led by the likes of Lionel Robbins and Dennis Robertson, attacked the book on both theoretical and practical grounds. They argued that Keynes' theory was logically flawed, that it ignored the role of prices and wages in adjusting the economy to full employment, and that it provided intellectual justification for dangerous levels of government intervention. Others, however, saw in the general theory a beacon of hope in a dark time. They recognized that Keynes had finally provided a coherent explanation for the Great Depression and a practical roadmap for escaping it. Among the most enthusiastic supporters of Keynes' work was the young economist Paul Samuelson, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize and become one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. Samuelson recognized that the general theory had changed the fundamental framework for thinking about the economy. He incorporated Keynes' ideas into his own textbooks, which reached millions of students and helped to establish Keynesian economics as the dominant paradigm in the decades that followed. Similarly, the American economist Alvin Hansen, who coined the term secular stagnation to describe the low-growth environment that many economists feared would persist after the Depression, became a leading advocate of Keynesian policy prescriptions. But the most important reception of the general theory was not in academic journals or university seminars. It was in the halls of government, where policymakers were grappling with the catastrophic consequences of the Depression. In Britain, the war Keynes had helped to fight was drawing to a close, and the question of how to rebuild the economy was at the forefront of political debate. Keynes himself had been involved in the negotiations over the post-war settlement, and he had witnessed firsthand the destructive consequences of the reparations imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. He had warned that the treaty would bring economic ruin to Germany and destabilize the entire continent. His warnings had been ignored, and the consequences had been catastrophic. Now, with the Second World War ending, Keynes had another opportunity to shape economic policy on a grand scale. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 was one of the most important economic events of the 20th century. Delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered in a resort town in New Hampshire to design the post-war international economic order. Keynes was the leading British delegate, and he played a central role in shaping the institutions that emerged from the conference. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created, along with a system of fixed exchange rates that would govern international trade for the next 2 decades. Keynes had envisioned a more radical system, one that would give greater power to an international clearing union and impose constraints on surplus countries as well as deficit countries. But his more moderate proposals were not accepted, and the final agreement reflected the interests of the United States more than his own vision. Nevertheless, the Bretton Woods system was a testament to Keynes' influence. He had helped to design the institutional framework that would govern the global economy for decades. The practical application of Keynes' ideas began in the United States with President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Although Roosevelt had not read the general theory before implementing his programs, the New Deal was essentially a Keynesian experiment in reverse. Keynesian economics argues that government spending should be increased during recessions to stimulate demand. The New Deal did exactly this, with massive public works programs, relief payments, and infrastructure projects designed to put people back to work and boost aggregate demand. Keynes himself was initially critical of the New Deal, arguing that it did not go far enough, but he later recognized that it had been on the right track, and he became an advocate for more aggressive fiscal stimulus. The true test of Keynesian economics came during the Second World War. The massive mobilization of resources for the war effort, combined with government spending on a scale never before seen in peacetime, finally ended the Great Depression. Unemployment vanished almost overnight as millions of men and women were drafted into the armed forces or hired in war industries. This was a dramatic vindication of Keynes' argument that insufficient aggregate demand was the root cause of unemployment and that government spending could fill the gap. The war had achieved what no private investment or monetary policy had been able to accomplish. After the war, Keynesian economics became the dominant paradigm in Western economies. Governments on both sides of the Atlantic adopted the principle of managing aggregate demand to maintain full employment. Fiscal policy became the primary tool of economic management, with governments using taxation and spending to smooth out the business cycle. Monetary policy played a secondary role, focused mainly on maintaining stable prices and manageable interest rates. This Keynesian consensus lasted for about 3 decades, from the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, and it was during this period that Western economies experienced unprecedented prosperity and growth. The post-war boom was the golden age of capitalism, and Keynesian economics was its intellectual foundation. But the Keynesian consensus began to unravel in the 1970s. The combination of stagnant growth and high inflation, known as stagflation, proved to be a fatal challenge to Keynesian theory. The Phillips curve, which had been a key component of Keynesian policy, suggested a stable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Policymakers could reduce unemployment by accepting higher inflation, or they could reduce inflation by accepting higher unemployment. But in the 1970s, both inflation and unemployment rose simultaneously, violating the predictions of the Phillips curve. This was a crisis for Keynesian economics, and it opened the door to a new generation of critics. The most important of these critics was Milton Friedman, who led the monetarist challenge to Keynesian economics. Friedman argued that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, caused by excessive growth in the money supply. He criticized Keynesian fiscal policy for being prone to lags and for creating inflationary pressures. He also revived the classical belief in the self-correcting nature of markets, arguing that government intervention was more likely to destabilize the economy than to stabilize it. Friedman's monetarism, along with the emerging school of rational expectations, posed a serious challenge to the Keynesian consensus. By the early 1980s, many economists had abandoned Keynesian economics in favor of monetarist and supply-side approaches. The 1980s and 1990s saw the decline of Keynesian economics as the dominant paradigm. Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Britain implemented policies that were deeply skeptical of government intervention. Tax cuts, deregulation, and privatization became the hallmarks of the era. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, fought inflation with aggressively tight monetary policy, deliberately causing a recession to break the back of inflation. These policies were largely consistent with monetarist and supply-side thinking, not with Keynesian economics. The Keynesian consensus that had dominated post-war economic policy was replaced by a new orthodoxy that emphasized market freedom and limited government. But the triumph of this new orthodoxy was short-lived. The financial crisis of 2008 and the Great Recession that followed it shattered the confidence that markets could be trusted to self-correct. Central banks slashed interest rates to near zero. Governments launched massive fiscal stimulus programs. The Federal Reserve engaged in unprecedented quantitative easing, purchasing trillions of dollars in assets to inject liquidity into the financial system. These were all Keynesian policies, and they were implemented by governments that had spent the previous 2 decades denouncing Keynesian economics. The crisis had forced a return to the ideas that Keynes had articulated 70 years earlier. The 2008 financial crisis was a powerful vindication of Keynes' insight that economies can get stuck in equilibrium with high unemployment and that government intervention is necessary to restore demand. Central banks had pushed interest rates to near zero, but the economy remained weak. This was precisely the situation that Keynes had described in his theory of the liquidity trap. When interest rates are near zero and confidence is low, monetary policy becomes ineffective, and fiscal policy is the only tool left. Governments that had embraced fiscal austerity in the years after the crisis were slow to respond, and the result was a prolonged period of weak growth and high unemployment. Countries that embraced Keynesian stimulus, like the United States under the Obama administration, recovered somewhat faster, though the recovery was still sluggish by historical standards. The pandemic recession of 2020 brought another dramatic test of Keynesian economics. When the coronavirus crisis hit, economies around the world ground to a halt. Governments responded with massive fiscal packages, including direct payments to individuals, expanded unemployment benefits, and loans to businesses. The scale of government intervention was unprecedented, and it was justified explicitly in Keynesian terms. The goal was to maintain aggregate demand in the face of a catastrophic collapse in private spending. The results were mixed but generally positive. The economies that deployed the largest fiscal stimulus packages, like the United States, recovered faster than those that adopted austerity, like many European countries. Once again, Keynes' ideas proved relevant to the challenges of the moment. The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money is not just a book about economics. It is a book about human psychology, about the forces that drive human behavior, and about the social and political consequences of economic failure. Keynes understood that the economy is not a machine that operates according to fixed laws. It is a complex system driven by the expectations, fears, and aspirations of millions of individuals. He recognized that confidence can be fragile, that panic can spread, and that a loss of faith in the future can bring an entire economy to its knees. These are insights that transcend economics and speak to the human condition. One of the most enduring contributions of the general theory is its emphasis on the role of uncertainty in economic decision-making. Keynes argued that the future is fundamentally unpredictable, and that this uncertainty lies at the heart of economic instability. Investors cannot know with certainty what the future will bring, and this uncertainty makes them hesitant to invest. When uncertainty rises, investment falls, and the economy contracts. This insight has become increasingly relevant in an age of rapid technological change, geopolitical instability, and environmental crisis. The uncertainties of the 21st century are unlike anything that Keynes could have imagined, but the basic logic of his argument remains as relevant as ever. The general theory also contains a profound critique of the classical view of human nature. Classical economists had modeled human beings as rational calculators who respond to incentives in predictable ways. Keynes recognized that human beings are not rational calculators. They are driven by emotions, by instincts, by animal spirits. They make decisions based on incomplete information, on gut feelings, on the expectations of others. This psychological realism was a major advance over the classical model, and it has influenced not just economics but also psychology, sociology, and Political science, the field of behavioral economics, which has become one of the most important developments in economics in recent decades, owes a direct intellectual debt to Keynes' insight that human behavior is not always rational. Keynes himself was a man of extraordinary breadth and intellect. He was not just an economist but also a philosopher, a mathematician, an art collector, and a biographer. His early work on probability theory, a treatise on probability, was a significant contribution to the foundations of statistics and decision theory. His biography of David Hume, published posthumously, was widely praised for its insight into the great philosopher's character and ideas. His involvement with the Bloomsbury Group connected him to the artistic and intellectual avant-garde of his time. All of these interests and experiences enriched his economic thought, giving it a depth and richness that few economists have matched. The writing style of the general theory is not the most accessible in the economic literature. Keynes was not known for his clarity, and the book is dense with technical arguments and intricate reasoning. Some readers have found it frustratingly difficult to follow, but the difficulty of the text should not obscure the profundity of its ideas. Keynes was grappling with problems of enormous complexity, and he did not always find the simplest way to express his solutions. The book rewards careful reading and repeated engagement. It is not a book that can be understood in a single sitting, but it is a book that reveals new insights with each rereading. One of the most important chapters in the general theory is the one on the marginal efficiency of capital, where Keynes explores the forces that drive investment. He argues that the marginal efficiency of capital is determined by two factors: the expected yield from the capital asset and the supply price of the asset. The expected yield depends on the investor's expectations about the future, which are inherently uncertain and subject to sudden shifts. The supply price depends on the cost of producing the capital asset, which is influenced by the state of the economy and the availability of resources. When expected yields fall or supply prices rise, the marginal efficiency of capital declines, and investment becomes less attractive. This is a simple but powerful mechanism that explains why investment can collapse so dramatically during recessions. The chapter on the propensity to save is equally important. Keynes argues that the propensity to save is not a fixed ratio but varies with income. At low levels of income, people save little or nothing because they need to consume everything they earn to survive. As income rises, the proportion saved increases. This has important implications for the relationship between saving and investment. If people save more out of any given level of income, this does not automatically lead to more investment. It leads to less consumption and therefore less income, which reduces the total amount saved. The paradox of thrift is the insight that what is good for an individual, saving more, can be harmful for the economy as a whole if everyone tries to save more at the same time. The general theory also contains a sophisticated analysis of the business cycle. Keynes argued that the business cycle is driven by fluctuations in investment, which are in turn driven by fluctuations in the marginal efficiency of capital. These fluctuations are amplified by the multiplier effect, which magnifies the initial change in investment into a larger change in income and employment. The result is a cycle of boom and bust that is inherent in the capitalist system. There is no automatic mechanism that prevents the economy from swinging between periods of overinvestment and underinvestment. This was a profound challenge to the classical view that the business cycle was a temporary deviation from a stable equilibrium. Keynes' analysis of the role of expectations in the business cycle is particularly relevant today. In an age of social media and instant information, expectations can shift with extraordinary speed. A viral tweet, a breaking news story, or a sudden geopolitical event can trigger a wave of panic or euphoria that sends markets tumbling or soaring. The speed and volatility of expectation shifts in the digital age are far greater than anything Keynes could have imagined, but the basic mechanism he described remains the same. Expectations drive investment, investment drives aggregate demand, and aggregate demand drives employment and output. The general theory also contains an important discussion of the distribution of income and its implications for economic stability. Keynes argued that unequal distribution of income tends to be destabilizing because it reduces aggregate demand. Rich people save a larger fraction of their income than poor people, so when income is concentrated at the top, a larger portion of total income is saved rather than spent. This reduces consumption demand and can lead to insufficient aggregate demand. This insight has important policy implications. It suggests that policies aimed at reducing income inequality, such as progressive taxation and social welfare programs, can also contribute to economic stability by boosting aggregate demand. One of the most fascinating aspects of the general theory is its treatment of the relationship between saving and investment. Classical economists had argued that saving determines investment, that the supply of savings sets the amount of investment that is possible. Keynes reversed this causal relationship. He argued that investment determines saving, that the level of investment determines the level of income, which in turn determines the level of saving. This reversal was one of the most important theoretical innovations of the general theory. It means that the economy is not constrained by the amount of saving that is available. The amount of saving adjusts to the amount of investment, not the other way around. This has profound implications for economic policy. It means that governments can stimulate investment through fiscal policy, and the resulting increase in income will generate the saving that is needed to finance that investment. The general theory also contains a nuanced discussion of the role of government in the economy. Keynes was not advocating for the abolition of markets or the establishment of a centrally planned economy. He was advocating for a mixed economy in which the government plays an active role in managing aggregate demand. He recognized that markets are efficient at allocating resources in many circumstances, but he also recognized that they can fail systematically when aggregate demand is insufficient. In such circumstances, government intervention is necessary to restore equilibrium and prevent unnecessary suffering. This was a moderate and pragmatic position, and it was very different from the socialist alternatives that were popular at the time. Keynes' vision of the role of government was also shaped by his belief in the importance of democratic institutions. He was a staunch defender of liberal democracy and saw government intervention in the economy as essential to preserving democracy in the face of economic crisis. He feared that prolonged unemployment and economic hardship would lead to political extremism and the collapse of democratic institutions. This fear was well-founded, given the rise of fascism and communism in the 1930s. Keynes believed that democratic governments had a responsibility to ensure full employment and economic stability, not just for economic reasons but for political reasons as well. The general theory also contains an important discussion of the role of the financial system in the economy. Keynes was deeply concerned about the destabilizing effects of speculative finance. He argued that the separation of decision to save from decision to invest, mediated by the financial system, creates the possibility of disequilibrium. When financial institutions channel savings into investment, they can amplify fluctuations in confidence and expectations. A wave of pessimism can lead to a credit crunch, which depresses investment and output. A wave of optimism can lead to a credit boom, which inflates asset prices and creates bubbles. The financial system is not a neutral intermediary but an active participant in the business cycle. This insight has proven remarkably prescient in the context of the 2008 financial crisis. The crisis was triggered by a collapse in the housing market, but it was amplified and transmitted through the financial system. Banks that had lent heavily to subprime borrowers found themselves insolvent, and the resulting credit crunch spread throughout the economy. The crisis was a textbook example of the kind of financial instability that Keynes had warned about in the general theory. It showed that the financial system can be a source of instability rather than a mechanism for stabilizing the economy. The general theory also contains an important discussion of the role of wages and prices in the adjustment process. Keynes argued that wages and prices are downwardly rigid, meaning that they do not adjust quickly enough to clear markets. This rigidity is due to a variety of factors, including labor contracts, minimum wage laws, and the reluctance of workers to accept nominal wage cuts. Because wages and prices do not adjust quickly, the economy can remain in a state of disequilibrium for extended periods. This is another reason why government intervention may be necessary to restore full employment. Keynes' analysis of the wage-price rigidity has important implications for monetary policy. If wages and prices are rigid, then changes in the money supply may not immediately affect prices. Instead, they may affect output and employment in the short run. This gives monetary policy a role to play in stabilizing the economy. However, Keynes also recognized that monetary policy has limitations, particularly in a liquidity trap. When interest rates are near zero, increasing the money supply may not lower interest rates further, and the economy may remain stuck in depression. In such circumstances, fiscal policy is the more effective tool. The general theory also contains a fascinating discussion of the concept of animal spirits. Keynes used this term to describe the emotional and psychological forces that drive economic behavior. He argued that much of economic activity is driven not by rational calculation but by instinctive impulses. Investors act on a spontaneous urge to action rather than on the weighted average of conflicting advantages. This insight has been validated by decades of research in behavioral economics. People are not the rational calculators that classical economics assumes. They are influenced by emotions, by social norms, by herd behavior, and by cognitive biases. Understanding these psychological forces is essential for understanding how economies actually work. One of the most enduring legacies of the general theory is its impact on economic policy. The ideas in the book were rapidly adopted by policymakers around the world. In the United States, the Employment Act of 1946 committed the federal government to the maintenance of maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. In Britain, the post-war Labour government implemented a program of nationalisation and welfare state expansion that was firmly rooted in Keynesian principles. Similar policies were adopted in many other countries. The Keynesian revolution was not just an intellectual revolution, it was a political revolution that reshaped the relationship between government and the economy. The influence of the general theory extended beyond national borders. The Bretton Woods system, with its fixed exchange rates and capital controls, was designed to give governments the policy space they needed to pursue full employment. The International Monetary Fund was created to provide short-term financing to countries facing balance of payments difficulties, allowing them to maintain their domestic policies without resorting to destructive deflation. The World Bank was created to finance reconstruction and development. These institutions reflected the Keynesian conviction that international cooperation was essential for maintaining global economic stability. The decline of the Keynesian consensus in the 1970s and 1980s did not mean that Keynes' ideas had been refuted. It meant that the political and intellectual climate had changed. The stagflation of the 1970s posed a genuine challenge to Keynesian theory, and monetarist and supply-side alternatives offered different explanations and policy prescriptions. But the fundamental insights of the general theory remained valid: the possibility of insufficient aggregate demand, the multiplier effect, the role of expectations and animal spirits, the potential for a liquidity trap, the importance of government intervention. These were all ideas that could not be easily dismissed. The financial crisis of 2008 and the Great Recession that followed it was a moment of reckoning for Keynesian economics. The crisis demonstrated that the financial system could be a source of severe instability, that markets could fail catastrophically, and that government intervention was necessary to prevent a collapse of the entire economic system. The massive fiscal stimulus packages and monetary interventions that were deployed around the world were explicitly Keynesian in their logic. They were designed to boost aggregate demand, to fill the gap left by collapsing private spending, and to prevent a downward spiral of falling incomes and rising unemployment. The fact that these policies were implemented by governments that had spent the previous 2 decades denouncing Keynesian economics was a testament to the enduring power of Keynes' ideas. The pandemic recession of 2020 brought another test of Keynesian economics. The sudden shutdown of economies around the world created an unprecedented collapse in aggregate demand. Governments responded with massive fiscal packages that were designed to maintain household incomes and business viability. The scale and speed of these interventions were remarkable, and they were justified in explicitly Keynesian terms. The goal was to prevent a collapse in demand that could have led to a depression on a scale not seen since the 1930s. The results were mixed, but the basic logic of the intervention was sound, and it prevented what could have been a catastrophic economic collapse. Looking back at the general theory from the vantage point of the 21st century, it is clear that Keynes' insights remain profoundly relevant. The book addresses the fundamental question of why economies sometimes fail to provide employment for all who want to work, and it provides a framework for understanding and addressing this failure. The concepts of effective demand, the multiplier, animal spirits, the liquidity trap, and the role of government intervention have become central to the economic discourse. They are taught in every introductory macroeconomics course and debated in every policy discussion about how to respond to economic crises. But the general theory is more than a collection of economic concepts. It is a work of profound moral and political significance. Keynes was concerned with the suffering of ordinary people who were unemployed and unable to find work. He was concerned with the stability of democratic institutions in the face of economic crisis. He was concerned with the possibility of a more just and equitable distribution of income. These are not just economic questions, they are questions about the kind of society we want to live in. The general theory is a call to action, a demand that governments take responsibility for the welfare of their citizens and use the tools of economic policy to achieve full employment and economic stability. The book also challenges us to think more deeply about the nature of economic knowledge. Keynes recognized that the future is uncertain and that economic forecasting is inherently limited. He was skeptical of the idea that economists could predict the future with any precision, and he argued that economic policy should be guided by principles rather than precise forecasts. This humility in the face of uncertainty is a valuable lesson for contemporary economists and policymakers. The complexity of the economy means that no model can capture all the relevant factors, and policymakers must be prepared to adapt their strategies as new information becomes available. The general theory also has important implications for our understanding of the relationship between economics and other social sciences. Keynes was deeply interested in psychology, philosophy, and history, and he brought this broad intellectual perspective to his economics. He understood that economic behavior is shaped by psychological factors, cultural norms, and historical contexts. This interdisciplinary approach has become increasingly important in contemporary economics, with the rise of behavioral economics, economic history, and the economics of culture. The general theory was ahead of its time in recognizing the interconnectedness of economic, psychological, and social phenomena. One of the most powerful aspects of the general theory is its ability to explain real-world events. The book was written in the aftermath of the Great Depression, and it provides a coherent explanation for the catastrophic unemployment and economic collapse that had gripped the world. It explains why the economy did not self-correct, why interest rate cuts did not restore confidence, and why government intervention was necessary. The theory has been applied to countless other crises and recessions, and it has consistently proven to be a useful framework for understanding economic downturns. The 2008 financial crisis, the European debt crisis, the pandemic recession, these are all events that can be understood through the lens of the general theory. The book also contains insights that are relevant to contemporary debates about inequality, climate change, and technological change. The question of how to distribute income in a way that supports aggregate demand is more relevant than ever in an age of rising inequality. The question of how to finance the transition to a green economy is a question of investment and aggregate demand. The question of how technological change affects employment is a question that Keynes himself would have found deeply interesting. The general theory provides a framework for thinking about all of these issues, and it continues to generate new insights and applications. In conclusion, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money is one of the most important books ever written in the field of economics. It changed the way we think about the economy, about the role of government, and about the relationship between individuals and society. It provided a coherent explanation for the Great Depression and a practical roadmap for escaping it. It gave birth to modern macroeconomics and shaped economic policy for decades, and it continues to be relevant today, as we grapple with the challenges of financial crises, economic inequality, and global instability. To read The General Theory is to engage with ideas that have shaped the modern world, and to understand the intellectual foundations of the economic policies that continue to affect our lives every day. The story of The General Theory is not just a story about economics. It is a story about a brilliant mind grappling with the greatest economic crisis of the 20th century. It is a story about the power of ideas to change the world, and it is a story about the enduring relevance of Keynes' insights, which continue to illuminate the path forward even as the challenges of the 21st century evolve and change. The General Theory is not a relic of the past. It is a living work that speaks to the present and to the future, reminding us that the economy is not a natural phenomenon that operates according to fixed laws, but a human creation that can be shaped and guided by the choices we make. As we face the economic challenges of our own time, from financial instability to climate change to technological disruption, the lessons of The General Theory remain as relevant as ever. We need governments that are willing to act decisively to support aggregate demand. We need policies that recognize the role of expectations and confidence in driving economic behavior. We need an economic framework that prioritizes full employment and human welfare over abstract notions of market efficiency. The General Theory provides all of these things, and more. It is a book that deserves to be read, studied, and debated by anyone who wants to understand the economy and the world we live in. John Maynard Keynes died in 1946, just a year after the Bretton Woods Conference. At the age of 62, he had changed the world, and he had done it with the power of his ideas. The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money was his masterpiece, the book that would define his legacy and shape the course of economic history. It is a book that challenges us to think differently about the economy, about government, and about ourselves. It is a book that demands our attention and rewards our engagement, and it is a book that will continue to be relevant for as long as economies face the possibility of insufficient demand and governments face the responsibility of responding to it.